My name is Linda, and I'm 78 years old, and I need to tell you something that took me 6 decades to understand. Something I wish someone had sat me down and said when I was still young enough to change course. I spent most of my life being good at being a woman, and I mean that in the most painful way possible. I was good at making people comfortable, good at shrinking myself into whatever shape the room needed, good at smiling through things that deserved tears, and staying quiet when I should have screamed. I was, by every measure the world handed me, the perfect woman. And it cost me almost everything that was actually mine. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the second of 4 children, and from the time I was very small, I understood what was expected of me. Not because anyone sat me down and explained it. It was just in the air, the way cold is in the air in November. You don't need someone to tell you it's cold. You feel it. And what I felt all around me was that the women who were loved were the women who were easy to be around, easy to please, easy to forgive when they asked for too much, which meant they learned pretty quickly not to ask at all. My mother was that kind of woman, beautiful and capable and so thoroughly trained to put herself last that I'm not sure she even knew she was doing it. She cooked and cleaned and raised 4 children and never once said, in my memory, that she was tired. I worshipped her, and I became her almost completely without ever choosing to. When I was 19, I met John. He was 23 and handsome in that uncomplicated way that young men sometimes are, and he thought I was wonderful. He told me I was the most thoughtful woman he'd ever known. He said I was easy to love, and I remember feeling so proud of that. I held those words like a prize. Easy to love. I thought that was the highest compliment a woman could receive. We married when I was 21. I wore a dress my mother had helped me sew, and I stood at the front of a church full of people who smiled at me, and I made promises I intended with my whole heart to keep, and I did keep them, every single one. But somewhere in the keeping of those promises, I stopped making promises to myself. I stopped asking what I needed. I stopped even wondering. In the first years of our marriage, I was teaching, elementary school, second grade, and I loved it in a way I didn't love many things. Those children, the way their minds worked, the way a 7-year-old could look at a caterpillar with more genuine wonder than most adults bring to their entire lives. It fed something in me that I didn't have words for at the time. It made me feel like myself. Then our first son was born, and then our daughter 2 years later, and John's career was growing and we moved to a bigger city for his work, and teaching just became impractical. That was the word we used. Impractical. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't even really a conversation. It was more like a door that slowly swung closed, and neither of us remarked on it. I stayed home with the children, and John worked, and I told myself this was what I had chosen, and in a narrow sense, that was true. But what I didn't understand then was that choosing something because it seems expected is not the same as choosing it freely. I wouldn't understand that for a very long time. The children grew up. I poured myself into them, into the house, into John's social obligations, into being the wife that made his life run smoothly. I planned dinners and remembered birthdays and kept the pantry stocked and made sure everyone had what they needed, and I was genuinely good at it. People complimented me constantly. "Your home is always so warm, Linda. You make it look effortless. John is so lucky." And I smiled and I thanked them, and I felt the warmth of their approval like sunlight, because I had learned so early that approval was the substitute for the other thing, the deeper thing, the thing I couldn't have named. I think the thing I couldn't name was a self, an actual interior life that belonged only to me, that I tended the way you tend a garden, not for anyone else's pleasure, just because it was alive and it was mine. When I was in my late 40s, my daughter went through a difficult divorce, and I threw myself into supporting her so completely that for almost a full year I barely slept. I drove 3 hours every weekend to be with her and the grandchildren. I cooked, I cleaned her house, I took the children so she could rest, and I never once said I was exhausted. Because saying you're exhausted is admitting you have a limit, and I had spent my whole life pretending I didn't. That year, something cracked in me. Not broke, not collapsed, just cracked, quietly, the way old wood does under too much weight. And I started waking up at night with a feeling I didn't recognize at first. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like a question, a long, slow, wordless question that rose up from somewhere underneath all the usefulness and competence and goodness. The question was something like, "Where are you, Linda? Where have you been?" I started therapy at 53. That was the first truly brave thing I had done for myself in over 3 decades, and I want to be honest about how hard it was to walk through that door. I sat across from a woman named Dr. Harmon, and she asked me, in our very first session, what I wanted. Just that. "What do you want, Linda?" And I opened my mouth and nothing came out. Not because I was shy, but because I genuinely didn't know. I had wanted things for other people for so long that I had lost the entire architecture of my own desires. I sat there in that chair and cried in a way I hadn't cried since childhood, not because anything terrible had just happened, but because I suddenly understood how long I had been missing. Therapy helped me see the shape of what I had done, not what had been done to me, because no one had forced me into this life. John was not a villain. He was a man of his generation who had been handed a certain kind of marriage and accepted it gratefully, the same way I had been handed a certain kind of womanhood and accepted it. We had both been living inside a story that neither of us had written. The difference was that the story had cost him very little, and it had cost me the better part of myself. I started painting at 55, badly at first, and then less badly, and now at 78 I paint almost every morning, and it is one of the truest pleasures of my life. I tell you that not because painting saved me, it didn't. What painting did was give me a space that was entirely mine, where no one needed anything from me, where I could be uncertain and clumsy and exploratory without it affecting anyone else's dinner or happiness or sense of security. It gave me a room of my own, not just a physical room, but an interior one, and I had never had that before. Not really. John and I are still together. We are different with each other now than we were for most of our marriage, and I think we are both relieved by that, though we rarely talk about it directly. I am less accommodating than I used to be. I say when I'm tired. I say when I disagree. I take up more space, not in a way that is aggressive or unkind, but in a way that is simply honest. And our marriage is better for it, which is perhaps the most bittersweet irony of my life, that the version of me John loves most is the one I spent 60 years hiding. Our children sometimes comment on how different I seem than when they were growing up. My daughter said to me a few years ago, almost in passing, that she was glad I was finally being selfish. She used that word without any judgment, just gently, observationally. I've thought about it ever since, the way we call it selfish when a woman simply tends to herself, the way we built an entire world that taught women that self-abandonment was love. It isn't love. I know that now. It is a slow erasure, carried out with good intentions and a smile, and it leaves marks on everyone, not just on you. If I could reach back through time and sit beside the 21-year-old woman standing in that church, I would want to hold her hand and say something very simple. I would tell her that being easy to love is not an accomplishment, that the shape you bend yourself into to fit someone else's life is not your shape, that the needs you silence don't disappear. They accumulate. They live in your body and in the quiet moments before sleep, and in the strange grief that comes in your 50s when you realize you have been a stranger to yourself for most of your adult life. I would tell her that you can be devoted and still have a self, that you can love people fiercely and still protect something that belongs only to you, that a life given entirely to others is not generosity. It is a vanishing act, And the tragedy is that it happens so slowly and so quietly that most women don't notice until they are standing somewhere in the middle of their lives or near the end of them, wondering who they would have been. I don't say any of this with bitterness. I want you to hear that clearly. I have a good life. I love my children and my grandchildren, and I have made peace with John in ways that feel real and earned. But I also carry the weight of 60 years of smallness, and I don't think that weight ever fully lifts. You just learn to carry it without letting it be the only thing. Whatever age you are when you hear this, I want you to ask yourself one honest question. Not the question of whether you are doing enough for the people around you, because I suspect you already know the answer to that. I want you to ask whether there is still a version of you living somewhere underneath all the doing, all the accommodating, all the being what everyone else needs you to be. And if the answer is yes, and I believe for most of you it will be, I want you to go find her. Not someday, now, because I am 78 years old, and I can tell you without any uncertainty that someday has a way of becoming never, and the woman you have been hiding deserves more than never. She deserves a whole life.